Welcome to this video. My name is Barry Beckham, and as you can see by the text on screen, we're going to take a look at filter techniques, but the filters that come with Photoshop. Now, I've always been a bit of a sucker for Photoshop filters. They were one of the very first things I experimented with when I first opened up Photoshop around 25 years ago. Now, we still have many of those same filters which are a part of Photoshop. We do have lots of others now we can choose from, but sometimes let's go back to basics and create something a little bit different. Way back in the early days of Photoshop, a friend of mine came up with the technique that I'm about to demonstrate. It just uses the filters within Photoshop, but I've never forgotten it. So if Barry Colhoun or someone who knows him happens to see this video, he'll know that he's still getting the credit for this idea. Now, Barry called this process dry, D-R-I-E, and those letters stood for something, but sadly I've forgotten exactly what. But when we start to think about filter effects, there really are no rights or wrongs. But generally speaking, try to start with a fairly bold subject. Images that contain fine detail are less likely to be successful. But of course I'm generalizing here quite a bit. There's always going to be the odd exception. Now, filters, whether they're the ones that come with Photoshop or the ones we can install later, they need a degree of experimentation. It's quite rare, I found, to apply one filter effect and get a wow result. Generally speaking, we've got to add a little bit of creativity too. Experimentation is part of the fun, and of course the tools of modern Photoshop allow us to do this much easier. We're not going to succeed every time we have a go at this, but that's all part of the fun. It's a bit like fishing. You're never entirely sure what you're gonna get. Or was that a line from Forrest Gump? Here you can see I'm starting with a raw file. I've opened the image up into Adobe Camera Raw. Now, if we're going to filter an image, what sort of changes do we need to make here? That's got to be a bit of guesswork, so let's put some in. I'm going to start with just a small crop, so with the crop tool selected at the top of the screen, click and drag of course, I just want to bring the right hand edge into the edge of that white building. I think I need all of that top part. Maybe I'll bring in the left hand side just a little bit, but not too close to the windows. Maybe a tiny little bit from the bottom. Anything from the top, maybe just down to the top of that chimney there. None of this is crucial, of course. I'll hit the enter key to commit. Now, what changes do I need here? Well, up to my lens corrections and remove chromatic aberration and lens profile corrections, and back to the basic tab. A little bit of everything here, or mix and match as I often call it. A little bit of clarity, a little bit of colour, a little bit of blacks to give it a bit of power. Maybe I'll drop the highlights to get a little bit more detail in the house. Maybe if I pick up my graduated filter, I'll just bring a graduated filter down there, and the highlights are down, the exposure is down a little bit, maybe even something similar in the foreground. I'm going to open this up into Photoshop as a smart object. Now, this picture was taken quite some time ago. The camera used was a Canon 1DS. It was the original, not the Mark II or the Mark III. So the pixel value, or the megapixels that this camera would capture, was 11 million if my memory serves me right. Now, one of the things I've discovered over the years is that filters seem to work better on a lower resolution image, and as we've decided to move away from photo quality to a more arty look, then taking away resolution is not such a big deal. So what I'm going to do with this image is I'm going to cut it in roughly in half. In other words, reduce the resolution by half, but keep the physical size. To do that, I can go to my image menu, image size, and you can see we've got virtually 4,000 pixels on the width. So what I'm going to do here is to just reduce them to 2,000. Now you can see we're going from a 58.7 meg file to a 15 meg file, and I'll hit Control 0 to refit the image on screen. So we're going to use this as the basis of our filtering. Now I'm working here on a raw smart object, so even though I've reduced the resolution of this image by about half, I can double click the thumbnail. We can go straight back into Camera Raw. I could make as many changes as I wish, and then I could click OK to apply those changes. What I'm going to do here though is I'm going to make a direct copy using Control J, and I'm going to right click alongside the thumbnail because I'm going to rasterize the layer. So I'm going to keep this one as my failsafe, but we're going to work on this copy here, because many people, I think, following a video like this may not be working from a smart object. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to convert this into a smart filter. So with this layer selected, go up to the filters menu, and up the top, convert for smart filters. We see a very similar little symbol at the bottom right corner. Now I may need a couple of copies of this, so let me turn this bottom layer off so we're not confused by that. So what I'm going to do here is make another couple of copies just in case. I'm going to turn the top two off and we'll just work on this one. Remember, the file size here isn't enormous. What I want to do here then is to apply a filter effect. The first of those filter effects is Filter, Artistic, Plastic Wrap. Now the settings we choose here are going to be experimental, and that's one of the good things of using a smart filter. What you could do is just make a note of the three values here, maybe 15, 9, 7 on a piece of paper. It doesn't look too bad to me, so rather than fiddle with them, let's just click OK and accept the default. If we look down at our thumbnail, the filter effect has been applied, but we also have a layer mask. If I select the layer mask and go to my toolbox, select black and maybe a soft edge brush, I can decide to remove the filter effect on some or part of the image I'm working on, and you can see the effect of that on the mask. I'll remove that with Control Z, so that may be useful. But the beauty of smart filters is if you look at the bottom here, you can see plastic wrap. So at any time I can double click that, we go straight back into our filters, so I could adjust these values. That's why I suggested if we wrote down 1597, we can always experiment a little later. But for now, I think I'm happy to move forward with those settings. What I'd like to do next is to put another filter effect over the top of this. So with the same layer selected, let's double click that and call it Filter. So with the same layer selected, let's go back to our filters, back into our artistic, and what I want here is my cutout filter, and I would say exactly the same about the settings here. You can always just look at the default settings 442, make a note on a piece of paper, but the effect I can see there doesn't look too bad, so I'm just going to accept the default. So one of the beauties now is that same layer mask still allows us to remove both of those filters together. Control Z will return that back. But I could, for example, go to my plastic wrap, which I applied first, double click that, go back in and make a change. So look at the highlight strength. Let me just quickly push it up to 20 and click OK. So now the two filters are being blended with those new settings. That's why writing down the original settings, the plastic wrap was 1597 and the cutout was 442. You can see what I mean about experimentation. Now let's stay with what I've got here for a moment. Whenever we start to apply filters and we start to think about what we're likely to do next, I think one of the things I'd like to do here is to put back some colour, because one of the things we've lost is that strong colour. If I turn that layer off for a moment, we can be reminded of the strong layer we had in the original. So that's why I took a couple of extra copies up here, because what I could do now is turn the layer above on, select it, and use the blend modes, and I'm going to use the colour here, because the colour is just going to inject the colour, but of course we'll still see the filter effect. Now we're in a situation where we can select the mask, which I've demonstrated a couple of times, and if we were going to use the mask, we probably wouldn't use it as I've demonstrated with 100% flow. So if you look up at the center top of the screen, I'm going to drop my flow rate down to about 10%, and if I use a fairly large brush, I could start to paint over the boat. So I could decide to bring back a little detail in areas that I want that detail to show. Now that's going to be different for every image we create. If I was applying a filter effect and the picture had people's faces, quite often you can imagine a filter effect like this can make people's faces look quite odd, so we may want to bring back a little detail. But once again, I am going to flood my mask with white to remove what I've just done, because what I prefer to do is sometimes that last layer I created, remember this one is just providing us with the colour, this one I just want to bring back some of the original. So I'm going to turn it on, and of course it immediately covers up the filter effect, but I can use the opacity at the top of the screen, take it fully off, then I can just bring it back gradually to get the sort of effect that I'm looking for. And we're all going to choose something slightly different, but that is looking reasonably appealing. So you can see where the experimentation comes in here. I could even now go back to my plastic wrap and say, rather than push it up to 20, what if I took it down to something like 9 or 10? Let's have a quick look. You can see the effect it has on the filter effect. Maybe that's something more to your liking. Double click once again. Let me go back to the original 15, and of course we haven't looked at any of the others either. So if I bring the detail down, you can see not too keen on that. If I push the detail up, then it could get a bit too heavy, but let's just click OK and take a look. See what I mean? Well, isn't it good that we can just go back in and we can say, no, I think we had it right first time, and because I jotted down those values on a piece of paper, I don't have to remember. I can just read that I've got 15, 9, 7. So I think the 15 works okay. But one last look at 20, and you can see now exactly where the experimentation comes in here. You know what? I think I'll go for the 15. There's not a great deal in it, is there? But the 15 is looking good. And of course we could do the same with the cutout. I've got this noted in front of me too, 442. Number of levels, let's push it up. You can see the effect of that. Click OK. That doesn't look too bad either. Well, I think we could spend quite some time doing this. Now I've saved my layered file here, just called it dry 001, because whenever we're doing this sort of work, there does come a time perhaps when we want to move on and flatten all of these layers together. But there is another thing we can do. If you just want to test the water with the 3 layers that make up the image we can see here, what we could do, we can hold or create a new blank layer at the top of your stack. You can hold the Alt key, go to the top right of the layers and choose Merge Visible, and all of those layers that we've got turned on have been placed in that one layer. So now I've got my image amalgamated into one, so I could go off on a different tangent here, start looking at slightly different effects, knowing I've still got these three sitting below. And of course I can hit Ctrl S at any time and I can overwrite my layered file. No damage being done, we've got everything safely stored. So maybe I'd like to do a bit of vignetting on this image. I think it's a little bit weak on the left edge, right edge, maybe on the bottom, even a little bit on the top. Well, there's a number of different ways we can do that, but I'm going to choose to do this in Camera Raw. Even though this image now isn't a raw file, I can still use Camera Raw on any other type of image because I can apply it through the filters at the top of the screen. There we have it, Camera Raw filter. Now if I pick up my Radial Filter, I can double click and it automatically applies the vignette shape. I'm going to right click and reset. Now I'm going to just bring this in a little bit, not much. Then I'm going to touch the V key to hide it. Then I can come over to my settings and decide what I want. So you can see I want to just give it a nice healthy darkening. The feather is up to 50, maybe I'll even increase that. So I want to give it quite a bit, I think. Maybe a little bit of shadows as well. That's not looking too bad, but still got a bit of weakness on the left and right. So I wonder if I could just add a delicate graduated filter. You can see experimentation, click OK, and there we have the image. Let's assume for the moment that we want to go forward with this. Even when I'm doing a filter effect like this, I still look around my image looking for any areas of the image that are distracting. Photographic principles still apply, so I'm going to go over to my toolbox and pick up my spot healing brush here, because there are one or two things. They're not big, but they're attracting me. I've got a little white square there I'm not too keen on, another one over to the right, and these little thingies sticking through the wall which are a little bit ugly. There's a something white in the foreground which I'll just remove, and you've got one or two others that you could do, and you can be a little bit too finicky with this sometimes, I know. So that's going to be personal, the sort of things that we're going to deal with here. But I'm reasonably happy with that. Let's get rid of the camera up there. What I'd like to do is perhaps apply a texture. But what texture? We could be applying lots of different textures until we found something that really works well. Well, here's another way of applying a texture over a different layer. Let's go up to our layers menu at the top of the screen. So what I need here is layer, new layer. I can name it, not vital, but I'm going to put a texture on this layer, so let's call it texture. I'm going to use a different mode here, so I'm going to drop down and select overlay, and I want to tick this little box that says fill the overlay with a neutral color, 50% grey. Now we would normally think that if we're going to create a new layer above the image we're viewing and we're going to flood it with 50% grey, it will cover up the image, but when I click OK, it doesn't do that. Even though we can see what appears to be a solid layer here, we can still see the image below. Now what I'd like to do with this layer here is to make it into a smart filter. So let's go to our filters and select it, convert to smart filters. And while I've got my cursor in the vicinity of the filters, I'm going to select filter, texture and texturizer. And the one that's appeared is the burlap. Now I think what we'll do to start with is I'm going to change the light to top left, and I'm going to look at the scaling. The scaling looks okay, relief looks okay. Let's apply it. and we get to see it with the image in question. And because we've created a smart filter, we've got the same options that we had before. We've got a layer mask, which allows us to temper the texture in areas where it may need it. But we've also got the opportunity now to double click the texture, go back in and change and see if there's another texture that's going to work better with the image we've produced. And we can do this as many times as we wish. Now from the drop down option box here, we usually see the 4 textures that Photoshop has: brick, burlap, canvas and sandstone. Canvas is one which I think many of us are familiar with, and even the sandstone is quite nice. I'm not sure the brick is appropriate, but sandstone is quite a nice texture. But I have a few textures that I've gathered over the years. If you do a search on the internet, I'm sure you'll find Photoshop textures that will be free to download. But if I go to this option and load texture, I need to go into my photography drive, my demo files, Photoshop. That's what I'm looking for, textures only. I've got some which are designated, as you can see, cloth, glass, leather, man-made rock, and you can try all of these different types of textures. Let's try cloth here, and inside here we've got a number. That's probably very similar to what we've just seen. Linen, loose threads. Let me go back. Let's think of paper. That usually throws up 1 or 2 nice ones. Now there's one that I quite like here, which I've used a few times, and that's linen. I think I've used handmade as well. So let me select linen. There you can see the texture, so we get the opportunity. What I sometimes do personally is push the relief up a little bit so I can see the texture strong. Then I decide on the scaling that I want, whether it's going to be small or large. And this is the beauty of being able to come back in here as many times as we like. Then I can adjust the relief. To be honest, I think the relief looks alright at 6 at the moment, but then we can try looking at this just from the left, just from the bottom. So we've got different effects here. Let's try one. Well, I think you get the idea. I think I'd like it a little stronger. Double click, back in. I'll change the light to top left so we get a different type, and maybe I'll put the relief up a little higher. I must admit that most of the time when I'm applying these textures, I'm way down in the 2s, 3s, maybe 4s, but there are 1 or 2 textures, and this is obviously one of them, which can take a little more in the relief value. Now what we do with our little stack of layers here is we just hit Ctrl S. We make sure they're all safely stored on our hard drive, and if we've got the patience, we close the image down and we come back and look at it again tomorrow. So why do we need to come back on another day? Well, overnight all those creative cobwebs which were clouding your decision making have all been blown away. Now you can look at your image in a fresh light. And as I look at the image, I'm reasonably happy with it. Perhaps I've darkened it just a wee bit too much, so I could decide to go back to my image. Just quickly jump back to my filters, camera raw filter. Just a tiny little bit of brightness, not much, but leaving everything else in place. And there I'm going to say we've made quite a nice filtered image. So changing images into smart filters or smart objects is a really good way of working, because even now I can select the mask of my textured layer, because if I think it's a little bit heavy up in the sky, I can select black, I can select a standard brush, I can drop my flow rate down to something like 5. So if I wanted to just lessen the impact of that texture, because the texture over that smooth area maybe is showing up a little bit more than it is elsewhere, maybe a little bit off the building, You can see we can do this in a delicate way, but we can leave the texture fully in place in other areas where it needs it. Thanks for watching, and if you're watching on YouTube and you've enjoyed my video, I'd like to ask you a favour. I'd like to ask you to subscribe to my channel and also hit the notification bell so you get informed whenever I post new videos. I do have quite a number of videos just like this one on a variety of Photoshop subjects. One is called Photoshop for Photographers because there needs to be a structure to learning Photoshop skills, and you'll find that structure in my Photoshop for Photographers. Around 60 videos are in that set. The first 14 videos in Photoshop for Photographers, which run in themselves for around 2.5 hours, are free for you to download and evaluate, so there's very little risk. I'm not sure where you could learn Photoshop for the price of one good meal and a beer. Come along to my website and you'll find Photoshop for Photographers from the main page. If you're watching on YouTube, I'll link to them below. If you're looking for more dedicated Photoshop subjects like RAW, selections or layers, I have dedicated subjects like those too.